Welcome explorers today. Dive into this thrilling TTP narration of Ghosts in the Avalanche by Banancake, an ongoing fan-made book from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Date, Standardized Human Time May 14, 2137. Chapter 3, Gentle Giant. Oh stars, it's right behind me, isn't it? Vivri asked in a hushed, paralyzed voice. Yeah. She's sitting down. She won't move unless I tell her to. I'm in full control, all right? I looked into her eyes, shaking her slightly. Lucky was trained, but not in the same way a normal dog would be. It was impossible to train the instincts out of her. Ultimately, she was half wild and always would be. She could be independent at times. Since I'd gotten here, she would usually stay out in the fields all day before returning home. If no one was giving her direct commands, she'd do her own thing, fulfill her wild instincts. She would roam the fields, running free, hunting as she pleased. There was much more space here than there was back in Hamilton, and Lucky was enjoying it to the fullest. She didn't seem interested in the sheep, but just to be safe, I would always feed her when she was near them. I snickered slightly as I looked at Lucky. Her expression was the polar opposite of Vivri's. My sister shifted nervously. What are you laughing at? I shook my head. Nothing. I'm going to turn you around, okay? Vivri swallowed. Okay. I spun her around gently to face Lucky. As soon as the wolf was in Vivri's field of view, I felt her go slightly limp. Oh stars, that thing is huge. Hearing Lucky being referred to as it and that thing irked me slightly. I reminded myself that I did the same at first. Yeah, she's pretty big, even for a wolf dog. She won't hurt you, I promise. Well, she's already hurt you, Vivri pointed out. Like I said, that was an accident. Do you trust me or not? A drop of dread from somewhere in my chest was interweaved in that question. The answer to that question could easily be no, and it would be completely justifiable after what I put her through. Vivri looked back at me in her peripheral. I don't understand you, but, yes. That bead of dread was washed away by a river of relief. I exhaled. Okay. I'm going to let you go. Just don't move. Lucky has been through a lot, and she can be spooked by new people. She gets afraid too. Just try to be calm. I released her and she drew back slightly. I stepped between her and Lucky, holding out a paw. I approached the wolf as she wagged her tail, kicking up dust from the gravel. Hey girl, I said quietly. She shuffled excitedly. It was difficult to maintain my composure for Vivri's sake. Her excitement was contagious, and my sister could easily mistake that excitement for aggression. I choked back a giggle. Stay there, I reiterated. I walked up to her and rubbed the sides of her face, sending her long fur flopping in either direction. Good girl. Lucky was massive. She weighed over 100 pounds, and the top of her head came up to my chin if she raised her head all the way up. As such, my face was always within licking range. If she were standing on her hind legs, she'd easily stand taller than most humans. Her appearance was almost indistinguishable from a wild wolf. The only minor differences were in the shape of her head and the dark patterns in her fur. Were it not for the reflective collar and harness, she could easily be mistaken for a wild predator. She was filthy, covered in dirt and loose blades of grass from her travels. Bathing her was usually a futile effort, but fortunately, she wasn't opposed to being hosed down whenever she got into the mud near the creek. She certainly made sure that everyone else involved got soaked as well. As well trained as she was, she'd always be a troublemaker. As much as I fought to keep my expression neutral, Lucky saw straight through it. She shuffled even more as airy whining sounds escaped her throat. I couldn't contain it anymore. I laughed as I pressed my head against hers and rubbed the sides of her face aggressively. You got me in trouble, I exclaimed. Lucky leapt up on her hind legs, easily overshadowing me as she stood up before hanging her front paws over my shoulders. I grunted as I struggled to hold her immense weight before we both slowly collapsed to the ground. Lucky stood over me, licking me as I squirmed to get away. "Vickery!" I heard my sister shout. I saw her running towards us before Garrett placed an arm in front of her. "It's all right there, miss. They do this all the time." He chuckled gruffly. "What? She's attacking high. Ack. TFT. Stop. You're filthy." I laughed. Lucky withdrew and stood over me. She let out a soft growl that grew into a bark. "Oh really?" I sat up and drove my head into her chest, pushing with my legs as I barely managed to roll her over. Lucky took hold of my forearm in her jaw as I sat over top of her. She applied only enough pressure for me to feel her sharp fangs piercing through my fur and grabbing at my skin. A humble reminder that she had the tools to tear my whole arm off. I let out a mock scream. The fearsome predator got me. I shouted playfully as she squirmed around on the ground, growling slightly. But she left her belly exposed. Lucky started squirming even more as I scratched her belly with my free paw. Somewhere in between bouts of laughter, I remembered Vivri was watching all of this. I lifted my head and looked over to see Andy and Garrett smiling while Vivri's jaw was practically in the gravel. I cleared my throat and looked down at Lucky. Sensing a shift in my demeanor, she released my arm after a few seconds, looking up at me attentively. Lucky and I stood up. "Okay, sit." Lucky complied immediately, and I rubbed the top of her head. "So, that's what playing looks like," I chuckled. Vivri took a nervous step forward. You're not hurt?" I held out my arms. "No. Didn't even break the skin. She's got a much better handle on her strength than she used to." My eyes darted between Lucky and Viv. "Do you want to meet her? Properly, I mean." "Meet her? Well, she needs to get your scent. She uses smell to identify people." Vivri visibly shuddered. "I'd have to let her smell me." "You don't have to right now, but eventually, you two are going to interact in some way or another. I'd just rather it be while I'm here." Vivri gulped as Lucky turned her gaze toward her. "What if she tries to play like she did with you?" I don't know how a dog operates." "Well, like I said, she's very emotionally aware. She'll know if you're nervous." I studied Vivri for a moment. Her tail flopped back and forth uneasily, and her ears were flat against the side of her head. I sighed and scratched under Lucky's chin, which she leaned into as her rear paw thumped against the ground a few times. "We can just do it later. I never planned on her being loose when you got here." I'm sorry, this is way too much for your first day." "I'll do it," Vivri interrupted. Behind her, I saw Andy and Garrett exchange a surprised glance before looking back at us. My ears shot up as I turned toward her. She was serious. "Are you sure?" Vivri took in a breath. "I want you to come home someday." "I know things are," she looked at Lucky, who had her tongue hanging out of the side of her mouth. "Different, with you now, but you're my brother. I want you to feel accepted. If you trust this predator, then so do I." She was giving me a chance. So far, she was the only one, but it was a relief nonetheless. I swished my tail as I walked toward her and took her paw. I gently led her across the lot toward Lucky. With every step, she felt stiffer and stiffer. She gripped my paw tighter and tighter as we approached. I could hear her breathing get faster and faster as her eyes widened. She was showing all the signs of a dramatic fear response, but she was pushing past it so far. With every step, I reassured her she was safe. Lucky lowered her head slightly as we approached, sensing my sister's unease. Her eyes were glued to Vivri as she curiously observed every move she made. This didn't seem to help Vivri's anxiety at all. I looked at the wolf. "Down," I said calmly. Lucky laid down on her stomach, resting her paws out in front of her. I hoped putting Lucky in a less threatening stance might help. It seemed to work, but only slightly. I stepped between Vivri and Lucky as we knelt down. "You're safe. Just hold out your paw." Vivri looked at me, fear plastered all over her face. I could even see tears beginning to form in her eyes. "She won't hurt you," I said plainly, holding eye contact with her the whole time. "I promise." Vivri hesitated for a moment before drawing in a breath through her teeth and reaching out, turning her face away from Lucky. Lucky stretched forward with her neck, bringing her muzzle just inches from her paw. She sniffed the air rapidly, taking in Vivri's scent. Vivri flinched, which caused Lucky to do the same. I held the Venlol's wrist. "Just hold still," I whispered. A slight squeal escaped her throat. Lucky sniffed a few more times before placing her head under Vivri's paw. She gasped, closing her eyes and turning her head completely away from her. After a moment, she slowly opened her eyes. Lucky met her gaze with a soft whimper. I snickered quietly. "I think she wants you to pet her." "What?" Vivri whispered back. "Like this." I gently moved her paw back and forth over Lucky's head. Vivri glanced at me before replicating the movement herself. She drew back, letting out the breath she'd been holding as she stood up. I stepped between her and Lucky, holding her by the shoulders. "Are you okay?" "Yeah. I think so." She panted for a moment. "I think that was the most terrifying thing I've ever done." I laughed. "You did good. Real good." I'd fully expected her to run away, but she did it. For me. I drew my sister in and wrapped my arms around her. She flinched slightly as I held her tight. "Thank you," I whispered. Vivri laughed. "I don't expect we'll be pals anytime soon, but you're welcome, I guess." I released her. "What you just did was more than I could have hoped for." I turned toward Lucky and tilted my head toward the road. "Run home." She darted away energetically, sprinting down the road. I laughed as I watched a small dust cloud form behind her. Garrett and Andy smiled as they watched her go as well. "Well now." Garrett stepped forward, clapping his hands as he rubbed the together. "Now that introductions are out of the way, it's time for dinner. All vegan, of course." He chuckled jovially. Linda from down the road gave us a whole mess of fruits and veggies from her gardens, so there's plenty of eating to be done. That day, I discovered that Vivri really liked watermelon. I could have sworn I saw her eyes glass over with the first bite, and from then on, no watermelon was safe in her grasp. She seemed to zone out on a slice, taking bite after bite as her tail twitched about wildly behind her, even smacking me in the face a few times. Andy, sitting on the other side of me, was giggling uncontrollably, but Viv didn't even seem to notice. She just kept devouring the fruit. Garrett hadn't even returned with the rest of the food yet. I placed a paw on her shoulder. "Vivri?" The Venlol jolted upright and turned to me. Her mouth was covered in juice, staining her fur pink. I choked back my laughter while Andy lost all control behind me. I laughed for a moment. More at Andy than anything. "You should, probably slow down. You might choke." Vivri wiped the juice from her face. "Oh. Yeah. Yeah, I probably should, huh?" She laughed before taking another bite. "It's just so refreshing. It really isn't even the taste, it's the texture." The front door closed, and Garrett walked down the steps and onto the gravel, carrying a woven basket full of apples. He approached and set the basket down on the table. "Well, I guess I should ask Linda for some more watermelons." Vivri swallowed. "Please do. These are great." She giggled before looking at me and taking another bite. "So what do you do here?" "Engineering stuff. Recently it's been mostly programming. The harvest will be coming up soon." "Programming?" "Programming the harvesters. I'll show you sometime." My watch suddenly buzzed, and I looked down to see a message displayed on the screen. We did it. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up from the bench. Give me a second. I walked away a few steps and sent a message back. All of it. All of it. Permits. Proper housing. Transportation. Security. Space Corps even said they'd like you to visit for exposure training. You don't have to be screened for predator disease. Lucky doesn't have to stay with exterminators. All you have to do is get here. I stood there motionless for a few seconds, gazing down at my watch, rereading the message again and again. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to jump for joy or hide in a corner. I wanted this to happen, but it was all so soon. So sudden. I looked back up at my sister, who would occasionally glance over at me during her conversation with the others. I turned my back to her and sent another reply. Now is kind of a bad time. My sister is here on Earth and is staying for the rest of the month. Plus I turned around briefly to see my sister now staring across the lot, worry written on her face. A bit sudden. I paced a few times before another message arrived. The stars are aligned, Vikri, but they won't stay that way. I can't guarantee things will stay this ideal if you don't get here by the end of the year. I sighed and craned my neck toward the sky. Fluffy white clouds drifted gently in front of the sun. This was it. This is what I'd been waiting for, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't ready for this. I looked back down as another message arrived. This is your fight, right?